This is chapter 35 of Pride and Prejudice, or chapter 12 of volume 2. In the previous chapter, Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, even though her family's terrible and she's beneath him and she's of inferior birth and she really annoys him. Even though all of those things stand in their way, he still proposes to her. And Elizabeth is shook and angry and tells him off because he totally ruined Jane's life. And this is chapter 35. Elizabeth awoke the next morning to the same thoughts and meditations which had at length closed her eyes. She could not yet recover from the surprise of what had happened. It was impossible to think of anything else, and, totally indisposed for employment, she resolved soon after breakfast to indulge herself in air and exercise. She was proceeding directly to her favorite walk when the recollection of Mr. Darcy's sometimes coming there stopped her, and instead of entering the park, she turned up the lane, which led her farther from the turnpike road. The park paling was still the boundary on one side, and she soon passed one of the gates into the ground. After walking 2 or 3 times along that part of the lane, she was tempted by the pleasantness of the morning to stop at the gates and look into the park. The 5 weeks which she had now passed in Kent had made a great difference in the country, and every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught a glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and fearful of its being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating. But the person who advanced was now near enough to see her, and stepping forward with eagerness pronounced her name. She had turned away, but on hearing herself called, though in a voice which proved it to be Mr. Darcy, she moved again towards the gate. He had by that time reached it also, and holding out a letter, which she instinctively took, said with a look of haughty composure, "I have been walking in the grove some time in hope of meeting you. Will you do me the honor of reading that letter?" And then with a slight bow turned again into the plantation and was soon out of sight. So Mr. Darcy hands her a letter, he's a little annoyed and stuck up still, and then immediately walks away. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter, and to her still increasing wonder, perceived an envelope containing 2 sheets of letter paper, written quite through in a very close hand. The envelope itself was likewise full. Pursuing her way along the lane, she then began it. It was dated from Rosings at 8 o'clock in the morning, and was as follows. "Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments, or renewal of those offers, which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you, or humbling myself, by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot be too soon forgotten, and the effort which the formation and perusal of this letter must occasion, should have been spared, had not my character required it to be written and read. You must, therefore, pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice." So in Mr. Darcy's letter, he writes, "Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to marry me again. Let's just forget that happened, and I'm only writing this to clear my character. 2 offenses of a very different nature, and by no means of equal magnitude, you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was that, regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honor and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. Wilfully and wantonly to have thrown off the companion of my youth, the acknowledged favorite of my father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence than on our patronage, and who had been brought up to expect its exertion, would be a depravity to which the separation of 2 young persons, whose affection could be the growth of only a few weeks, could bear no comparison. But from the severity of that blame which was last night so liberally bestowed respecting each circumstance, I shall hope to be in future secured when the following account of my actions and their motives has been read. If, in the explanation of them which is due to myself, I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours, I can only say that I am sorry. The necessity must be obeyed, and further apology would be absurd." So Mr. Darcy says, "You accused me of 2 things last night, and they're not equal. The first was that I totally ruined Wickham's life by taking away his inheritance and his money, which he had counted on, even though I knew him from growing up with him. That would be horrible. What would be a lesser evil would be separating Jane and Bingley, who had known each other only for a few weeks." So according to Mr. Darcy, that's what he thinks of both situations. I had not been in Hertfordshire before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your elder sister to any other young woman in the country. But it was not till the evening of the dance at Netherfield that I had any apprehension of his feeling a serious attachment. I had often seen him in love before. At that ball, while I had the honour of dancing with you, I was first made acquainted, by Sir William Lucas's accidental information, that Bingley's attention to your sister had given rise to a general expectation of their marriage. He spoke of it as a certain event, of which the time alone could be undecided. From that moment I observed my friend's behaviour attentively, and I could then perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him. Your sister I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard. And I remained convinced, from the evening's scrutiny, that though she received his attentions with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in an error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that the serenity of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely to be easily touched. That I was desirous of believing her indifferent is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigations and decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes or fears. I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed on impartial conviction as truly as I wished it in reason. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to have required the utmost force of passion to put aside in my own case. The want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me, but there were other causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing, and existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavored to forget, because they were not immediately before me. Okay, so a lot is going on in this letter already. So Mr. Darcy says that accidentally Sir William Lucas mentioned that Jane and Bingley could get engaged. And he mentioned this wedding as a certain event, meaning that it was definitely going to happen. After that point, Mr. Darcy started observing Mr. Bingley and Jane, and he noticed that Bingley really did seem to be in love with her. His partiality was greater than any he had seen, so Mr. Bingley had never been that interested in any other woman before this. When he watches Jane, he sees that she's friendly and cheerful and open and inviting, but he doesn't believe that she's in love. Charlotte Lucas says something very similar to this way in the beginning of the book. She says that we should always, or women should always show more affection than they feel for a man because every guy likes encouragement and needs to feel kind of, supported and cheered on so that they can eventually continue their romance. So maybe he has a point there. He also mentions that he wanted to believe that she didn't truly love Bingley, that it was just sort of a flirtatious thing, that she wasn't really as interested in Bingley as he was in her. So he wanted to believe that, but he says, I trust that I can put aside my own feelings in circumstances like this. I don't know, you'll have to be the judge of that yourselves and see if you think that's true. He says that he does have some very serious objections, just like he had some problems with the idea of his proposing to Elizabeth. He had some problems of Bingley and Jane being together. He was also concerned that he's not quite as concerned for Bingley as he would be for himself, because he feels his station in life is higher. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit in our reading. But there were other causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing, and existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavored to forget, because they were not immediately before me. These causes must be stated, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison of that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you. So he says, the fact that your mom's family is not as high of a social class as Mr. Bingley or as me, as Mr. Darcy, the fact that they weren't of as high a social class wasn't the real issue. It was more their behavior. So more Mrs. Bennet's behavior, Elizabeth's three younger sisters, so Mary, Kitty, and Lydia, and also Mr. Bennet's behavior in certain situations. But amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations, and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that to have conducted yourselves so as to avoid any share of the like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your eldest sister than it is honorable to the sense and disposition of both. So Mr. Darcy admits, you and Jane did a great job. You fell under no sort of criticism. All of your behavior and actions were acceptable. I will only say farther that from what passed that evening my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened which could have led me before to preserve my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. His sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own. Our coincidence of feeling was soon discovered, and alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother, we shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friend the certain evils of such a choice. I described and enforced them earnestly. But however this remonstrance might have staggered or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage, had it not been seconded by the assurance, which I hesitated not in giving, of your sister's indifference. So Mr. Darcy says that he and Mr. Bingley's sisters, so Caroline and Mrs. Hurst, Louisa, they agree that it would be a poor choice for Mr. Bingley to marry Jane, and they, kind of team up. Mr. Darcy talks to Bingley and he says, this would be a poor choice. You're married beneath you, and moreover, you are marrying someone whose family does not always behave in an acceptable way. So he says all of that, but he says, I don't think it would have changed Bingley's mind about marrying Jane if he hadn't also said that Jane didn't really like him, wasn't as interested, was indifferent, in other words. So Darcy feels that that's really what put Bingley off. He had before believed her to return his affection with sincere, if not with equal, regard. But Bingley has great natural modesty, with a stronger dependence on my judgment than on his own. To convince him, therefore, that he had deceived himself was no very great point. So Darcy says that Mr. Bingley had maybe not believed that Jane liked him as much as he liked her, but he thought that she was being sincere. Darcy says, I think she's totally indifferent, that she doesn't care. And because Mr. Bingley is a very modest person, which makes sense with him being very friendly, and what we've heard about him basing some of his decisions on what other people will tell him and being very agreeable and listening to others, that makes a great deal of sense. So Darcy says that Bingley believes him and believes that Jane didn't like him as much as he liked her. And he also depends on Mr. Darcy's judgment. So we know that Mr. Darcy is a pretty imposing person. Mr. Bingley even admits it himself that Mr. Darcy is very convincing and imposing. So to persuade him isn't very difficult when Mr. Bingley already really trusts and values his friendship, and when you combine it with the fact that there is a factor of being imposing and perhaps even a little intimidating. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire when that conviction had been given was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. There is but one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town. I knew it myself, as it was known to Miss Bingley, but her brother is even yet ignorant of it. That they might have met without ill consequence is perhaps probable, but his regard did not appear to me enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, this disguise, was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. So Darcy says the one thing that he's not proud of, that he looks back on not with satisfaction, is the fact that he kept the fact that Jane was in London from Bingley. So they were both in London. They knew about it. Mr. Darcy knew about it, and Mr. Bingley's sisters knew about it, but Mr. Bingley himself did not know that Jane was there, and they deliberately concealed it from him. So Mr. Bingley had and still has no idea that Jane is in London, and Mr. Darcy was a key factor in keeping them apart and not letting Mr. Bingley know that information. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was unknowingly done, and though the motives which governed me may to you very naturally appear insufficient, I have not yet learnt to condemn them. So he says, I feel bad if I did hurt your sister Jane's feelings. This is the place that I came from. If you can't accept my motives, it is what it is. He doesn't feel ashamed of his actions in that respect, although he does feel sorry if he may have hurt Jane, and he does now understand that he may have underestimated how much Jane liked Bingley. With respect to that other, more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me I am ignorant, but of the truth of what I shall relate I can summon more than one witness of undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man, who had for many years the management of all Pemberley estates, and whose good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him. And on George Wickham, who was his godson, his kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Cambridge, most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from the extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. So now Mr. Darcy shifts gears, and he's talking about Mr. Wickham and what happened there. So he says, I don't know what Mr. Wickham accused me of, but this is the whole truth of the story. I can give you a witness to back up what I'm telling you and to confirm the truth of my account of the story. So far we have some things that agree with what Mr. Wickham said, that Mr. Wickham Sr. worked for Mr. Darcy, helped manage all of Pemberley estates, and our Mr. Wickham, George Wickham, was his godson. Mr. Darcy's father was very generous towards Mr. Wickham, and he even helped him pay for his education. Apparently, Mr. Wickham Sr. had a wife who spent a little too much money, and they wouldn't have been able to afford giving Mr. Wickham an education. So Mr. Darcy's father, Mr. Darcy Sr., helps pay for Wickham's education. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, whose manners were always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, he intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have. Here again I shall give you pain, to what degree only you only can tell. But whatever may be the sentiments with which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. So Mr. Darcy says, because he was the same age as our Mr. Wickham, he saw him in some unguarded moments, and he wasn't always behaving very properly. We get some vague accusations, vicious propensities, so nasty, a likeliness to do nasty things, want of principle, so not following principles, morals, rules, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend. So Mr. Wickham is hiding all of this from Mr. Darcy Sr., but our Mr. Darcy sees him in more open, unguarded, not watching out for someone older than him moments. And he kind of mentions that he knows Elizabeth may have been interested in Mr. Wickham at one point. He says, I'm probably going to pain you by talking about this. I don't really know to what extent, because only you know how much he liked Wickham. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that a valuable family living might be his as soon as it became vacant. There was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year from these events, Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage in lieu of the preferment, by which he could not be benefited. So, when Mr. Darcy Sr. passes away, he leaves a will and says, I want Wickham to go into the church. I'm hoping that's the profession he'll follow through. We have a house that we can give him. We can also give him £1,000. Mr. Wickham Sr. passes away after the death of Mr. Wickham Sr. Wickham writes to Darcy and says, I don't want to go into the church. I'm not going to take orders, holy orders, what you do if you're ordained as a priest, minister, etc. He says, I don't want to do that, but since I can't take any advantage from this living in this house, maybe you can give me a little bit of money because I can't be benefited by this church position any longer. He had some intention, he added, of studying the law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, were it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. So Mr. Wickham also says £1,000 is not really enough to help me get started now. So Mr. Darcy agrees to give him £3,000. So £2,000 more than he was supposed to get, although he doesn't get that church living. But he's choosing a totally different career. He's probably going to be a lawyer. Okay. He also, once he accepts those £3,000, Mr. Wickham says, yep, I waive all rights. I don't need that church living anymore. I have no claim to it. I'm, take that back. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, were it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite him to Pemberley or admit his society in town. In town, I believe, he chiefly lived, but his studying the law was a mere pretense, and being now free from all restraint, his life was a life of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him. But on the decease of the incumbent of the living, which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter for the presentation. So Mr. Darcy gives him the £3,000, thinks that they're not going to really talk again, doesn't invite Mr. Wickham to Pemberley to hang out. He doesn't really like him. They don't really get along, but everything is kind of pleasantly ended, he thinks. For 3 years, he doesn't hear from Mr. Wickham, but then the guy who had that church, house, and position dies, and Wickham writes again to Mr. Darcy. He applied to me again by letter for the presentation. His circumstances, he assured me, and I had no difficulty in believing it, were exceedingly bad. He had found the law a most unprofitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on being ordained, if I would present him to the living in question, of which he trusted there could be little doubt, as well as he was well assured that I had no other person to provide for, and I could not have forgotten my reverend father's intentions. My revered father's intentions. So Wickham says, hey, listen, you can't have anyone else that you're going to give this church career living to. Why not give it to me? Remember how much your father loved me, yada yada. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with his entreaty or for resisting every repetition of it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to myself. So Mr. Darcy says no to Mr. Wickham's request. He's also noticed that Mr. Wickham tried to study law, and that doesn't really work out. It seems that he doesn't really apply himself or do anything. He lives a life of idleness. Mr. Darcy says no, that he can't have that church position back, and then Mr. Wickham starts basically telling everyone how awful Mr. Darcy is, including Mr. Darcy himself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived, I know not. So after that, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham stop talking to each other. Mr. Darcy doesn't know what the heck he's doing. He doesn't know what Wickham does, doesn't really care. But last summer, he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present should induce me to unfold to any human being. In other words, he has a big secret, it's very confidential information, and if he were under any other circumstances, he would not tell anyone. Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. So he's assuming that Elizabeth and hoping that Elizabeth will not tell anyone else this information. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. We know that from Colonel Fitzwilliam as well. About a year ago, she was taken from school and an establishment formed for her in London, and last summer she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design, for there proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Mrs. Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived. And by her connivance and aid, he so far recommended himself to Georgiana, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love and to consent to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse, and after stating her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owe the knowledge of it to herself. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement, and then Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure, but I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately, and Mrs. Young was of course removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is £30,000, but I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. Okay, so after all of that happens and Mr. Wickham can't have his church position or any sort of extra money, he goes and follows Georgiana Darcy, 15 years old, 10 years younger than Mr. Darcy, goes and follows her where she's living with a friend, Mrs. Young, who's apparently also not the greatest person. He goes and follows her there, recommended himself to Georgiana, so makes Georgiana really like him. Georgiana remembers him when she was a kid, and George Wickham was very kind to her when they were kids. She remembers that, and he convinces Georgiana that she is in love, so he essentially seduces her. They're about to elope, which would be pretty disastrous for your character if you eloped and you didn't get married in Regency England. That was a big no-no. Would be a terrible scandal. So he tries to elope with her to get her money. 15-year-old kid that he convinces to run away with him so he can take her family fortune. Georgiana tells Mr. Darcy because she's Mr. Darcy kind of figures it out, and she sort of tells him he owes the knowledge of it to herself. So at some point, Georgiana told Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy joined them before they were about to elope. Georgiana tells him everything at that point because eloping with Wickham would ruin or malign or cast a very bad light on Georgiana's reputation. Mr. Darcy can't tell everyone. So this is a secret that is damaging to Wickham, but also damaging to Georgiana. So if Darcy were to out Wickham as bad guy, he would also cast some aspersions and some doubts and some negative energy on his sister's reputation. So he can't just tell everyone that Wickham is a terrible person. All right, £30,000. Also, another motive, in addition to Georgiana's money, which would be nice, the revenge on Mr. Darcy part would also kind of sweeten the deal, which is revenge on someone is not a good reason to marry someone else. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, madam, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together, and if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me henceforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood he has imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at, ignorant as you previously were of everything concerning either. Detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all this was not told you last night, but I was not then master enough of myself to know what could or ought to be revealed. For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more particularly to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who, from our near relationship and constant intimacy, and still more as one of the executors of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. If your abhorrence of me should make my assertions valueless, you cannot be prevented by the same cause from confiding in my cousin, and that there may be the possibility of consulting him, I shall endeavor to find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands in the course of the morning. I will only add, God bless you, Fitzwilliam Darcy. So he ends his letter by saying, in case you, hopefully this clears me of wrongdoing, at least in Mr. Wickham's case, and if you have questions about this or you don't trust what I'm saying, you can ask my cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam. He knows all about these situations, and he also knows about all of the information prior to the eloping with Georgiana thing. He knows about that because he was one of the people who managed, he was an executor of Mr. Darcy Sr.'s will. So he knew about Wickham asking for money multiple times, and as Georgiana Darcy's guardian, he would also know about the Wickham scandal elopement thing. We get a hint of that. We get some foreshadowing in a previous chapter when Elizabeth's talking to Colonel Fitzwilliam and she's saying, oh yeah, young girls usually give you trouble, right? Is she a troublesome girl? And Colonel Fitzwilliam kind of freaks out and he's like, what do you mean? So that may give us an indication that this letter holds some truth. And that is chapter 35.